pronounced.
Recording
However,
in progress.
when the time came, I took my chance. I perceived by the tense and expectant faces of the people that Simmons was behind me, willing me with all his might. I tried my best to imagine what he wanted, but nothing suggested itself. I felt ashamed and miserable then. I believed that the hour of my disgrace was come, and that in another moment I should go out of that place disgraced. I ought to be ashamed to confess it, but my next thought was, not how I could win the compassion of kindly hearts by going out humbly and in sorrow for my misdoings, but how I could go out most sensationally and spectacularly. There was a rusty and empty old revolver lying on the table among the properties employed in the performances. On May Day, 2 or 3 weeks before, there had been a celebration by the schools, and I had had a quarrel with a big boy who was the school bully, and I had not come out of it with credit. That boy was now seated in the middle of the house, halfway down the main aisle. I crept stealthily and impressively towards the table with a dark and murderous scowl on my face, copied from popular romance, seized the revolver suddenly, flourished it, shouted the bully's name, jumped off the platform, and made a rush for him and chased him out of the house before the paralyzed people could interfere to save him. There was a storm of applause, and the magician addressing the house said most impressively, that you may know how really remarkable this is and how wonderfully developed a subject we have in this boy, I assure you that without a single spoken word to guide him, he has carried out what I mentally commanded him to do to the minutest detail. I could have stopped him at a moment in his vengeful career by a mere exertion of my will. Therefore, the poor fellow who has escaped was at no time in danger. So I was not in disgrace. I returned to the platform a hero and happier than I have ever been in this world since. As regards mental suggestion, my fears of it were gone. I judged that in case I failed to guess what the professor might be willing me to do, I could count on putting up something that would answer just as well. I was right, and exhibitions of unspoken suggestion became a favorite with the public. Whenever I perceived that I was being willed to do something, I got up and did something, anything that occurred to me, and the magician, not being a fool, always ratified it. When people asked me, how can you tell what he is willing you to do? I said, it's just as easy. And they always said admiringly, well, it beats me how you can do it. Hicks was weak in another detail. When the professor made passes over him and said his whole body is without sensation now, come forward and test him, ladies and gentlemen. The ladies and gentlemen always complied eagerly and stuck pins into Hicks, and if they went deep, Hicks was sure to wince. Then that poor professor would have to explain that Hicks wasn't sufficiently under the influence. But I didn't wince. I only suffered and shed tears on the inside. The miseries that a conceited boy will endure to keep up his reputation. And so will a conceited man. I know it in my own person, and have seen it in 100,000 others. That professor ought to have protected me, and I often hoped he would, when the tests were unusually severe, but he didn't. It may be that he was deceived as well as the others, though I did not believe it, nor think it possible. Those were dear, good people, but they must have carried simplicity and credulity to the limit. They would stick a pin in my arm and bear on it until they drove it a third of its length in, and then be lost in wonder that by a mere exercise of willpower, the professor could turn my arm to iron and make it insensible to pain. Whereas it was not insensible at all. I was suffering agonies of pain. After that fourth night, that proud night, that triumphant night, I was the only subject. Simmons invited no more candidates to the platform. I performed alone every night the rest of the fortnight. In the beginning of the second week, I conquered the last doubters. Up to that time, a dozen wise old heads, the intellectual aristocracy had held out as implacable unbelievers. I was as hurt by this as if I were engaged in some honest occupation. There is nothing surprising about this. Human beings feel dishonor the most sometimes when they most deserve it. That handful of overwise old gentlemen kept on shaking their heads all the first week and saying they had seen no marvels there that could not have been produced by collusion. And they were pretty vain of their unbelief, too, and liked to show it and air it and be superior to the ignorant and particularly old Dr. Peake, who was the ringleader of the irreconcilables and very formidable, for he was an FFV. He was learned, white-haired, and venerable. nobly and richly clad in the fashions of an earlier and courtlier day. He was large and stately, and he not only seemed wise, but was what he seemed to be. He had great influence, and his opinion upon any matter was worth much more than that of any other person in the community. When I conquered him at last, I knew I was undisputed master of the field. And now, after more than 50 years, I acknowledge, with a few dry old tears, that I rejoiced without shame. Dictated December 2nd, 1906. In 1847, we were living in a large white house on the corner of Hill and Main Streets, a house that still stands and isn't large now, although it hasn't lost a plank. I saw it a year ago and noticed that shrinkage. My father died in it, March of the year mentioned, but our family did not move out of it until some months afterward. Ours was not the only family in the house. There was another, Dr. Grant's. One day, Dr. Grant and Dr. Rayburn argued a matter on the street with sword canes, and Grant was brought home multifariously punctured. Old Dr. Peake caulked the leaks and came every day for a while to look after him. The Grants were Virginians, like Peake, and one day, when Grant was getting well enough to be on his feet and sit around in the parlor and talk, the conversation fell upon Virginia and old times. I was present, but the group were probably quite unconscious of me, I being only a lad and a negligible quantity. Two of the group, Dr. Peake and Mrs. Crawford, Mrs. Grant's mother, had been of the audience when the Richmond Theater burned down 36 years before, and they talked over the frightful details of that memorable tragedy. These were eyewitnesses, and with their eyes I saw it all with an intolerable vividness. I saw the black smoke rolling and tumbling toward the sky. I saw the flames burst through it and turn red. I heard the shrieks of the despairing. I glimpsed their faces at the windows, caught fitfully through the veiling smoke.